Now we're going to begin our discussion of the American legal system and specifically the courts that support it. To begin with, you have to understand the rule of law. What does law do in a democracy? First, it provides security. In a law-abiding society, you are reasonably sure that you're not going to be killed on the street and have your neighbor just invade your home. Law prevents crimes, generally speaking. It also provides predictability. We know in a democracy what the laws are, and that allows us to predict the behavior of people, organizations, and governmental agencies. So a law allows you to guess how other people will act. That's a very useful thing in order to get along in society. It helps us resolve conflicts. Specifically, it allows us to not have to rely on informal methods of conflict resolution. It allows us to very specifically and formally address problems that may arise. It allows us to also show our values. Law is a way for us to show what we believe in and what we value. And the laws that we pass are reflections of our social values. Lastly, law is there to distribute the benefits and rewards society has to offer and allocate the costs of these benefits and rewards. So all the great things that we have are distributed by law. And the courts are there to make sure that the distribution of the things in our society is as fair as we think it should be. Now, is it a perfect system? No. Does it work out pretty well most of the time for many people? Yes, I think that can be generally argued. But remember, in any legal system, especially one like ours, there will be winners and there will oftentimes be losers. And we've already seen examples of how that has happened as we have progressed through the semester. And you will continue to see more examples of the fact that sometimes some policies are really there and they don't serve to make people more equal, they serve to make people less equal. And how we decide whether or not those are good ideas or bad ideas is often a matter of law. We get our laws from various sources. Now, there are constitutional laws from both state and federal constitution. There are common laws. Common law is a term that means that these are laws and decisions that come from other legal cases. The Latin phrase for that is stare decisis, and you can see that there on your screen. Stare decisis means let the decision stand. So it is common law practice that if one court makes a decision, other courts will generally follow suit. They don't have to, but in common law tradition, a lot of our laws begin to be applied the same way because of the principle of stare decisis. There is also statutory law, which comes from legislatures, both at the state and federal level. Statutes tend to be more like regulatory things, just like administrative laws. Administrative law is from bureaucracies and agencies. And there are executive orders that come from presidents and governors. So there's all these different sources of law in this blended legal system that we have. And if you really begin to look at this, there are quite a few regulations, rules, and laws that people are bound by in our society. Very importantly, we will spend a great deal of time talking about judicial review. Judicial review is the ability of the Supreme Court to overturn as unconstitutional acts of Congress. And this has a long history, but we want to begin there with Hamilton in the Federalist Paper number 78. In Federalist 78, Hamilton said the judicial branch is the least dangerous branch of government. There is just nothing in this branch that makes it an equal partner whatsoever. The Supreme Court has neither the power of the purse nor the sword, meaning it cannot end funding to programs like Congress does, nor can it go to war or send police out to get you like the executive branch does. It has neither the purse nor the sword. So this means that the court, as it was originally designed in the Constitution, was rather weak. Judicial review is approved of by Hamilton because it would check the passions of the people. However, the Constitution was written without judicial review as part of the document. So judicial review, as you know from our study of the Constitution, comes from the Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison. Where in Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court made a ruling where it gave itself its most important power. That's kind of amazing. There has not been a more ostentatious grab of power in American democracy, perhaps ever. In so doing, this made the federal judicial branch a co-equal branch with the other two branches. And it was done by Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, a man who many say is perhaps the greatest Supreme Court Chief Justice of all time. In judicial review, keep in mind that it is usually not used against the federal government. Rather, the judicial review is typically used to strike down state laws. States tend to go against the Constitution far more frequently than the federal government, so the judicial review is usually used against states, less often against the federal government. Question: why is judicial review important? How would our politics be different without it? Take a few moments, pause this video, write a solid paragraph about that. Really think. Judicial review is a critically important concept. How would it be different without, how would American politics be different without that? Go ahead and pause the video, write, and then resume. Now we're going to discuss the notion of jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is a term that means that kind of sets the power of a court. Jurisdiction tells a court what cases it can and cannot hear. There is both original and appellate jurisdiction. In original jurisdiction, that means that a case has to start in that particular court. And under appellate jurisdiction, a case has to be appealed up to that level of court. So here you see some courts have original jurisdiction. U.S. district courts and state trial courts have original jurisdiction. Some cases will just begin there because they're so important in the case of U.S. district courts, or if they just matter to one state, in the case of state trial courts, some cases just begin there. Some cases have appellate jurisdiction, which means they don't, no cases start there, but rather cases are appealed there. And this is the U.S. Courts of Appeals, any state-level appeals courts, and state supreme courts. These are all courts with appellate jurisdiction. And lastly, you have the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has both original and appellate jurisdiction. So if you take a look there, you can see that depending on what kind of legal case you are trying to press, your case will begin at different places. Our U.S. court system has 3 levels. You have the federal district courts, the circuit courts of appeal, and the U.S. Supreme Court. State court structures are the same. You have trial courts, that's where trials occur. You have appellate courts and state supreme courts. So when we talk about the structure of the federal system, state systems have very similar structures. And we call this a dual court system. So if you start there at the bottom of the screen, you have on the left United States District Courts. There are 94 of them scattered throughout the country. That is where your case would begin if you have a federal case. If you have a state case, it starts in a state trial court. You can see the various kinds of state trial courts there. You have superior courts, probate courts, county courts, etc., etc. If you don't like your verdict at the U.S. District Court or the state trial court, you can move up to an appeals court. Now, an appeals court doesn't have to hear your case. They may not. If they hear your case and then you still don't like it, you can appeal up to the state Supreme Court. Now, the state Supreme Court, or the Supreme Court of the United States, is the court of final resort, essentially. Except for the case where if you take your case to the Ohio Supreme Court and you still don't like your verdict, your ruling, you can appeal yourself over to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court is the ultimate ruler over this entire system, however. What the Supreme Court says is the word of law. All other courts are expected to follow what the Supreme Court of the United States says. So that figure there, that system, is what we call the dual court system, where power over different cases, jurisdiction over different cases, is given to both the federal and state systems. The U.S. district courts are the lowest levels of the federal court system. There are 94 of them. Every state has at least one. They hear both criminal and civil cases. Juries deliver verdicts at U.S. district courts, and juries are supposed to be made up of a group of your peers, essentially, other citizens who will rule on your case, and a judge presides over the entire thing. Above that's the U.S. Court of Appeals. These are arranged into 12 circuits. Now, this is only an appellate jurisdiction. So there's no new evidence, there's no new witnesses. And at the U.S. Court of Appeals, there are no juries. A panel of 3 judges makes a ruling. A jury does not. So here, the U.S. Court of Appeals, if they decide to hear your case, they will then make a ruling deciding whether or not the lower court did the right thing or not. Here's a map of the federal judicial circuits. You can see for District 6, which includes Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee, our district court there, the appeals court, rather, the U.S. Court of Appeals for District 6 is in Cincinnati. And that's a big deal. That having that in that city is an important thing. If you look around, there are some districts that are just enormous. For example, District 9 has everywhere from California to Alaska, Hawaii, Montana, Washington. That is an enormous district. Whereas District 3 is Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, and the Virgin Islands. There's a special district that oversees Washington, D.C. That is District 12. And that's because Washington, D.C. has special rules and regulations governing it, given that it is not an official state. Now, this brings us up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, on the U.S. Supreme Court, you have 9 justices appointed by the president. They have to be confirmed by the Senate, and they serve for good behavior for life. Essentially, they can have the job as long as they wish or until they die. They can be impeached, but that is a very, very uncommon occurrence, and in American history, we have never impeached a U.S. Supreme Court justice. We presently have 9 justices, and that has been the number for some time, but it's not always been 9. And the Constitution does not say whether it should, the Constitution doesn't say what number it should or should not be. So we have settled on 9, but it doesn't have to be that. Here you see some presidential appointees to the federal bench, to federal courts from 1989 to 2011, and this shows the diversity that different presidents have pushed. Definitely, if you look down the lines here, Obama has made the biggest strides towards putting more women, African Americans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans on the bench. Probably the person that has done the least would be President Bush, and then President Clinton would be kind of in the middle there. If you look, there are still not a lot of women and minorities on the federal bench, and Obama has really tried to push to make that change. Question: which is more important, judicial diversity or judicial competency? By this I mean, is it important to have a judge that looks like the people he or she is judging? Or is it important to have a judge that really knows the law and is a legal expert? So if you had to pick diversity or competency, which would you have to pick? Please don't take a middle ground. Try to make a statement here. Try to go out and really try to stake out a claim. Explain your reasoning in no less than a paragraph. Pause the video, and when you are ready, go ahead and resume. Let's discuss the selection of judges, and we do this differently depending on whether you're at the state or federal level. To begin with, at the state level, it kind of varies by state. In some states, governors appoint judges. In some states, such as Ohio, there are elections for judges. In some other states, there are partisan elections, meaning that just one party would vote for their judge and put up their judge. At the federal level, all federal judges are nominated by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. Now, often what will happen is we will invoke a senatorial courtesy for lower level federal courts. This means that whoever the president picks for lower level courts will just be automatically approved. It's a courtesy to the president, and then the real fights happen over Supreme Court justices. And speaking of Supreme Court justices, that is a very important job. That is a job you have for life. You will have dramatic impacts on the democracy, and as such, we need to pick the right people. We begin with who is simply the most meritorious, who is the best judge for the job. Beyond that, we go into the ideas of political ideology. Whether you are a constructivist judge or an interpretivist judge. Constructivist means that you believe that the Constitution was written in such a way, and you should not just go making up new rulings if they're not found in the Constitution. Interpretivism is the idea that the Constitution's made to adapt, and your rulings will be an interpretation of the Constitution. That's a big difference. Generally, conservative judges tend to favor constructionism, and liberal judges tend to favor interpretivism. You can also get appointed to the Supreme Court as a reward for your political patronage, or in the last one, is that we occasionally will select judges to represent certain groups, such as Judge Sonia Sotomayor, our most recent Supreme Court nominee, and how she was nominated to the Supreme Court and then appointed not simply because she was an outstanding academic and judge, but also because she represents the Hispanic community in the United States. So this is the criteria that are oftentimes considered for Supreme Court appointments. If you look here, this figure gives the judicial confirmation rates of various presidents from Truman all the way up to Obama. As you can see, Truman only got about 18 judges confirmed per year. Obama's at about 38. So there are quite a few judicial nominees that Obama's getting confirmed. He's got about a 78% approval rating for that. So that's pretty good, and you can see throughout the years that these numbers have changed based on who the president at the time happens to be. Now, the Supreme Court doesn't simply hear any case that it is asked to hear. Rather, you need to petition the court, generally speaking, for cases that need to be heard. Often this is done through a writ of certiorari. A writ of certiorari is a written explanation by a losing party from a court case asking the Supreme Court to take up the case. If the Supreme Court grants the writ of certiorari, then the case is brought up from the lower court and the court will hear it. Now, to determine this, 4 justices have to agree to hear a case. This means that a minority of judges, since there are 9 justices total, a minority of the justices can get a case to be heard. That being said, only about 2% of anyone filing a writ of certiorari will have their cases heard. Very, 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 very few cases make it to the Supreme Court. They are only the ones that are most important. Additionally, beyond the appellate jurisdiction of the court also has original jurisdiction over some cases. These tend to be cases involving the federal government or foreign governments in cases between the states. This is less than 1% of cases, though these tend to be rather important cases. Here is an explanation of the pathway to and through the Supreme Court, which I won't go through with you here, but please check out your book, Figure 10.6, to make sure you're familiar with how cases make it to the Supreme Court. Now, like I said, there is judicial activism and judicial restraint, and then there's also judicial activism and judicial constructionism. Activist judges tend to look for cases to hear in order to pass judgments. Now, these are judges that are out there constantly trying to push an agenda, and they're searching for cases to hear. A judge who uses restraint will hear fewer cases and will only hear cases based on the merits of the case, not the political or social changes that might occur based on the ruling. And we already spoke about judicial activism and constructionism based on whether or not judges strictly adhere to the Constitution or if they actively interpret the meaning of the Constitution. If they actively interpret, we usually call them activist or interpretivist judges. If they adhere to what the Constitution says, we refer to them as constructionists. Now, after the Supreme Court hears a case, an opinion, at least one opinion, is given out. An opinion explains why the court ruled how it ruled and gives the explanation behind their logic. The Chief Justice will assign the opinion writing to someone who's in the majority of the vote. So if it's a 5-4 vote in the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice will assign the opinion to someone in the majority. If in the off chance that the Chief Justice happens to be in the minority, then the senior most justice in the majority assigns the opinion. And he or she can either take it for him or herself and write the opinion, or they can assign the opinion to someone else. The opinions are very important. This gives us a window into how the Supreme Court works and the logic behind their reasoning. Other justices are able to write either concurring or dissenting opinions. A concurring opinion is one written by another justice that agrees with the ruling, but for a different reason. A dissenting opinion, as you might be able to guess, is an opinion written by a justice who disagrees with the majority. Dissenting opinions are of particular importance because if a case is lost in the Supreme Court, but there is a dissenting opinion from one of the justices explaining how a future case may be won, then that dissenting opinion may serve as a blueprint for a legal tactic to get a new case heard before the court in the hope of overturning whatever the decision was. And here's our last question. Explain the value of dissenting opinions. We just discussed it. Take a few moments, do that, and let's wrap this video up.